Hi everyone, this is the second lecture of week 3. And again, you can listen to this video as an audio instead. And again, please read the biblical story before you listen to the video. Okay. So last time we left off with the beginning of the flood narrative and the unanswerable question that the flood narrative raises, which is what can possibly justify God's attempt to destroy the entire universe and everything in it? Notice, and I spoke about it briefly last time, that this ethical problem or question only exists if we have certain assumptions about God, namely that God is fair and that there is only one God, not many gods. Okay. And just to remind everybody, like I said before, or as I hinted, that's not quite the assumption that undergirds the biblical text. Okay. In Hebrew, I said this before, every time it says God, or the translator has put down God, it actually says gods. Okay. And I think this mistranslation by the translators of gods as God, I think exacerbate these theological problems. Okay. Or to put it slightly differently, I do think there are times in the text when some of the theological problems that it poses can easily be resolved if we envision a kind of different kind of more polytheistic-y, more henotheistic system. Okay, and the flood narrative really fits into one of these stories that actually resolves or become ethically more palatable once you assume a different kind of theological system. Okay. As I said before in the last video, the problem with the flood is that there's nothing that can justify why God, that is, the one powerful monotheistic God in control of everything, would commit an unethical act like wholesale murder of the entire world. Okay. And so let's think about this a little bit. Why is this a problem? Well, because we assume that if there is one God, okay, if we assume that, then God there isn't anyone else, any other God up there trying to stop this God or going behind his back and doing bad things, okay? In short, if you imagine God in a monotheistic system, this God has to be good, okay? Yet the world as we know it and as we live in it, and as the writers lived in it, well, it was not so good at times. Okay, so how do we explain why bad things happen if there is only one guy, one good guy up there in charge? Okay, well, you can't, or not very well. Okay, and this is the classic problem of evil in a monotheistic system. Okay, this ethical problem becomes less severe when we don't assume those things. Okay, and how do we know that they become, sort of less severe if we don't assume these things? Well, by comparing the flood narrative as we have it and as we traditionally understood it, okay, and I mean by traditional in churches and so forth, with other flood narratives from the ancient Near East, okay, which is what I'm going to do today and right now, okay. The flood narrative is a narrative that is found throughout the world. Indeed, there's a Chinese flood narrative. For some reason, this must have been it's almost a universal story, okay? And as the biblical text is the product of the ancient Near East, what you'll do is you'll compare the story of the flood in the Bible with literature from the same region, okay? And indeed, there's a couple of flood stories. The most famous one, there's a ancient Near Eastern flood narrative from Akkad, okay, which is modern day Iraq, called Atrahasis, okay? And Atrahasis sounds remarkably similar and yet interestingly different from the narrative that we have in the Bible. In Atrahasis, the gods also decide to send the flood to wipe out humankind. But in this story, in the Akkadian story, there are many gods, and there's a reason given for why they all decide to kill everything, okay? The gods in this narrative create humans to do the work that they don't want to do, which makes sense. That's what you would do if you're like a god. Okay. However, the gods grow frustrated over the noise that the humans make. Okay. And the noise seems to ever increase because there seems to be overpopulation. Okay. And because of this noise, the gods cannot sleep. Okay. Notice how much more understandable the gods in this story are. So the gods can't sleep because of the noise that the humans are making. And they try to initially kill some of the humans off by sending famine, yet they still won't decrease enough, okay? So the problem remains, okay? And as a result of this problem, the gods decide to send the flood. However, one god, who is named Enki, and he's a kind of interesting bringer of civilizations kind of god, okay. Well, Enki doesn't really wholesale agree to this plan by the other gods to send the flood. Okay. Indeed, Enki has like a favorite human being, like you would have a favorite pet or something. Yeah, okay. And this favorite human being is named Atrahasis. Or sometimes in a variant, another ancient Near Eastern flood story called Gilgamesh, his name may be Utanapishtim, which means wide of ears, which means like super wise. Okay. So Enki has a favorite guy named Atrahasis. Okay. Now, unfortunately for Enki, the other gods have all agreed that they're not going to tell any human beings about the flood. Okay. So he has like a problem on his hands, but Enki is very smart. Okay. So what Enki does is that he doesn't tell Atrahasis or Utanapishtim, depending on which version you have, anything directly. Okay. Rather, Enki talks about the flood behind a reed wall, and Atrahasis just happens to overhear what Enki said, and as a result, he builds a boat. Okay. And he and his family are the only ones that survive the flood. Now, after the flood, Atrahasis sends up a sacrifice, and we're told that the gods kind of, surround the sacrifice like flies, okay? And they realize something. The gods suddenly realize, oh my God, without any human beings, there's no sacrifices. And so because of that, they regret sending the flood, okay? Bespeaking the very interesting relationship between humanity and the gods realize it's actually impossible to be a god if there is no one around who will worship you. Okay. Or another way to put it is that the gods realize that they need humanity as much as humans need the gods. Okay. So they realize that humans are useful after all, and so the gods, they all vow never to destroy humankind again. Instead, they send diseases and other limitations are put on the life of a human being, so that population or overpopulation doesn't become a problem. Okay. Notice there are some similarities between this story, Atrahasis, and the biblical narrative of the flood. Okay. In the Bible, the flood is also implied as being caused by something having to do with population. Remember, I explained in the last lecture that some kind of population problem having to do with maybe the intermixing of the divine and the human. Okay. There are, however, interesting differences between Atrahasis and the biblical narrative of the flood. Okay. Notice in Atrahasis, there are more than one god. Okay. And because of that, because there is more than one god around, we don't really expect these gods to be super ethical. We expect them to be kind of ethical, okay, but not more ethical than, let's say, we would expect human beings to be ethical. Notice also that the relationships between humanity and the gods are very different on Atrahasis. Okay, humans in Atrahasis are created to be workers for the gods. Okay, and so the gods don't necessarily have a whole lot of natural regard for them. Okay, except of course for Enki, who has a kind of favor, who randomly likes Atrahasis for some reason. Okay. And when you assume, when you take on the system, the divine, the theological system of Atrahasis, when there's more than one god, when the gods are more human-like, okay, when the gods are ethically dicey like human beings, notice that with Atrahasis, we don't ask the same theological and ethical questions as we do with the biblical flood narrative. So notice with Atrahasis, we're not asking questions like, why do the gods act this way? How can the gods do this? Why? Because we don't have the same expectations of fairness and goodness and ethical behavior with a system where there are lots of gods as we would if there is only one God. Okay. Indeed, I'll probably talk about this later, but we'll see. Monotheism actually creates a whole slew of theological problems. Okay, like I said, if there's one God, God needs to be fair and good, but the world is so unfair, so not good. Okay, indeed, monotheism is probably a very difficult worldview to uphold. And indeed, it's not coincidence that as soon as you get kind of strict monotheism, all of a sudden you get the creation of other semi-divine beings like demigods, angels, and demons. Okay, as if our minds can't handle a monotheistic system very well. Okay. So again, as I stated in the last lecture, the biblical text and reading it becomes really complicated because we're not only dealing with the text, which itself comes from various different time periods, but we're also dealing with how people have interpreted throughout history at points with very different visions of God in mind. Okay. Anywho, returning to the biblical story of the flood, it is not just God and God's motivation and God's ethics that have been questioned with regards to the flood, but also the guy that God decides to save. Okay, so in Atrahasis, Enki randomly, we are told, likes Atrahasis, okay, and decides to save it. In the Bible, however, again, because of our own theological assumptions and desires, we need something beyond randomness to explain why it is Noah and not anyone else who is saved. Okay, and with the biblical text, we're not really comforted by the answer of, well, God just kind of likes him better. Okay. Now, if you read the biblical text very carefully, interestingly enough, the text posits two different, maybe conflicting, unclear certainly, reasons as to why Noah was saved above everyone else. Okay. The first, which is found in Genesis chapter 6, verse 8, is that just like in Atrahasis, Noah was saved just because, randomly, because God liked him better. So Genesis 6, verse 8 reads, "But Noah found favor in the sight of the Lord," just like Atrahasis, very similar. Okay. Now, as I said, we don't really like this answer, right? Why? Because again, our assumption is that God, this kind of one God in the Bible, has to be fair, he has to be good, he can't just randomly like people, right? Okay. And indeed, the biblical writers or maybe later editors, it's hard to know with the biblical text, also seem to have been bothered by the, hey, it's random answer, and they add a little bit more, okay, which is found in the next verse, Genesis 6, verse 9, which reads, "These are the descendants of Noah." Now, Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God. Okay. So it fills in a little bit more of an answer. This is certainly better than, I guess, randomness, but it's not still quite a satisfactory answer to why Noah and his family got to live while everyone else died. Okay, and notice how non-explanatory this description of Noah's goodness is. You know, if you read the biblical text, it just seems to say over and over again, well, he was really good. Yeah, very, 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 very good. Okay. As if the biblical writers had difficulty describing what made Noah so uniquely good that he alone deserved to live while everyone else died. Okay. Now, indeed, interestingly enough, if you read the rest of the text, and as I will talk about in subsequent videos, Noah, there's not really a whole lot of signs of Noah's exceptional goodness. Okay, so this description does not seem to be backed up by the other parts of the biblical text. He seems fine, okay, but not so exceptionally good to be the only survivor. Okay. Moreover, rabbinic readers have been troubled by Noah's response being told by God about the flood. Okay, namely, notice how Noah never says anything when he is told by God that God plans to send a catastrophic worldwide flood. And what the rabbis do is they ask this question, well, if Noah was so freaking good, why doesn't he do something? Why doesn't he warn his fellow human beings that there's a giant catastrophe coming? Why doesn't he argue with God? And we do know in other parts of the biblical text that you can get this God to change his mind. Okay, if Noah is so good, why doesn't he tell God this is a very bad, unethical idea? Maybe remind God to behave better. Okay. The fact that he says nothing seems to actually indicate that Noah was not very good, or certainly not very brave, but maybe also in that not very good. Okay. Again, the task of the writers was very difficult. Okay, the reality again is that nothing can truly justify the wholesale destruction and genocide of the world by God, and there is nothing that can also justify why Noah magically survives instead of anyone else. Okay, so really, again, they were tasked to explain something that was unexplainable. Okay. Now, let's briefly turn to the flood myth itself, okay, which runs from chapter 6 through chapter 9. And if you read Coogan, and I will reiterate now, the flood narrative is said to be two sources, J and P, which were kind of intermingled together. So unlike in Genesis 1 through 3, where you have the first source, P, and then you have the second source, J, kind of put together with the seam, with the flood narrative, you have them kind of, intertwined, okay? And you have to work very hard to kind of detangle them, okay? So I'm going to detangle them going back and forth, okay? So in the J version, the cause of the flood is human wickedness, and this is found in Genesis 6, verses 5 through 7. This is the J version. But in the P version, this is similar. The cause of the flood is that God is annoyed with violence and corruption. And this is found in chapter 6, verses 12 through 13. Okay. In the J version, there are 7 pairs of animals, clean animals and birds, okay, that are brought into the ark, as well as 2 pair of unclean animals, okay, 7, this is, Genesis 7, verse 3, okay. In P, slightly different, right? This is the one that we always remember. 2 of every animal, male and female, notice the same creation language by P, are brought into the ark instead of 7. And this is in Genesis 6:19. Okay. In J, the cause of the flood is rain. Okay. Genesis 7, verses 17 through 19. In P, the cause of the flood is almost an undoing of creation. And what we're told is that God opened the floodgates. So the universe is really imagined as this kind of pocket or kind of oblong bubble of structure that God creates in the midst of chaos. Chaos surrounds this bubble of creation. Okay. And what God does in P is that he opens the windows, both on top and the bottom of this bubble, allowing the chaos that surrounds it to come in and consume, almost subsume the created structured universe. Okay. In J, the flood lasts 40 days and 40 nights. This is in Genesis 7:4. 40 is a number you'll find throughout the biblical text. You have to be careful with numbers because people have read all kinds of crazy stuff. But 40 is a significant number. Usually it's the number of testing. Okay, so you'll find the Israelites wander in the desert for 40 years. Jesus is, I think, tempted in the wilderness for 40 days. So you'll see 40 over and over again as the number of testing. Okay, in P, contrary to that, the flood lasts an entire year. Okay, we are told in Genesis 7:24, the waters grew strong for 150 days and then took time to recede. Okay. In the J version, after the flood, Noah releases 3 doves in succession. And when the last dove doesn't return, he knows that it's safe to go out. This is found in chapter 8, verses 8 through 12. In the P version, after the flood, Noah sends out 1 raven. Okay, this is in chapter 8, verse 7. Okay, in the J version, Noah offers sacrifices, which God smells. Okay, very similar to Atrahasis. This was found in chapter 8, verse 21, while in P, Noah and his family are blessed after the flood in language very similar to kind of a second creation. He is told to be fruitful and multiply. And this is found in Genesis 9:1. Okay. What's interesting is that when we think about the flood narrative, and I don't know why it's such a favorite in Sunday school for children, what we do is we kind of collapse all these things together, or collapse the two flood narratives into one and flatten out all the details. Okay, and so remember some and don't remember others. Okay. For what happens after the flood, please turn to the next video.